I'm really delighted to have this panel and this discussion. We've got some very, very experienced executive professionals here with, I think, a lot to offer as we're entering the digital era for the enterprise. And this particular session is really on that topic, and it's really about thriving, right? Thriving in the emerging digital era. So with me, I have immediately to my right, Nikki De Henry. Nikki is the Chief Innovation Officer for Deloitte Consulting in the US. And then next to Nikki is Cindy Stoddard. Cindy is an SVP and the CIO of Adobe. And then to my farthest right is Soni. Bobby is the Chief Solutions Services Officer for Hitachi Vantara. And we're going to talk about a variety of different dimensions. It's just going to be an open dialogue and discussion. We'll touch on what's really happening in the enterprise, try to help you get a little bit behind the headlines and hear the perspective of some people that have been on this journey with the enterprises that they represent, but also in helping their clients become digital, so to speak. And we're really, I think, in many respects, just getting started on this journey. So we're going to touch on overall business model transformation, what it really means for an enterprise to rethink how it creates value. We're going to touch on systems and processes and how those are impacted. We'll talk a little bit about the underlying technologies themselves. What are people really using in digital transformation for enterprises? We'll touch on workforce issues, a little bit on privacy, security, and then look into our crystal ball and give you a little bit of forward look and also talk about some lessons learned. So a lot of things to cover. And with that, I think where we want to start is just allowing each of you to introduce yourself, talk a bit about your experience, your current role, and some of the ways in which you're either helping your own enterprise or helping your clients with digital transformation.
Great. Shall I start? All right. Hi, I'm Nikki De Henry, as Paul just said. Thank you for having us today. I have been in consulting for a little over 20 years, and specifically at Deloitte for about 14. I started with Deloitte when we were just starting our government practice. And I know many of you in the audience are probably like, oh, government practice, what could she tell me about digital, right, and innovation? But given the scale, the size, and the complexity of our government clients, it's really been an incredibly informative, challenging space to be working in and from a digital perspective. I've worked with clients in manufacturing, like the Bureau of Engraving and Printing, that prints all of our nation's currency, and did one of our first cloud implementations there back in 2009, 2010. Doing asset intelligence with all of their machinery as well, to working at organizations like Amtrak, transportation and hospitality industry, in order to implement a digital experience with products like Adobe and Salesforce and other cutting edge tech. So I've really done the spectrum, and when you think about what government does, they do the spectrum of all of our industry businesses. So it's been a great journey. Currently, I serve as our Chief Innovation Officer for our entire consulting practice. And when I took the role last year, I was asked to really reinvent what that means for Deloitte. And for Deloitte, right, we are a traditional services business, been in business for over 100 years, providing services to businesses across the spectrum. And we have tried to shift, and we have been moving to the shift from services into the product side, but realizing we're not a products company, right? We're not a company that is built from a capital structure to develop products, from a talent structure to develop products, or just from a cultural perspective. And so we really needed to create more of a hybrid business, right, around services and intellectual property that can be more valuable to our clients. And so what do we bring? Our depth in our clients' businesses, our understanding of cross-industry challenges, and then the ability to partner with others. So what we're starting is a initiative called Deloitte Catalyst, which you'll start hearing about in the press very soon, focused around creating structured ways to interact with the startup community. We already have a group out in Tel Aviv and Israel that's been up and operational for a year, and we're starting our Silicon Valley operation here this month, where we'll be focused on developing relationships in specific domains so that we can help create new solutions and take them to market. So really looking forward to that.
Great. Good afternoon, everyone. I know it's late in the day, so hopefully this will be a great session for you. My name is Cindy Stoddard. I'm the CIO at Adobe. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about what I do at Adobe. My role as CIO is what I call a combo role. One thing that I have responsibility for is, of course, all the systems, looking at what we do for the back office, looking at how we, enrich the employee experience, and then also all of our data infrastructure. But along with that, I also have responsibility for providing a seamless service to our customers for all of our cloud-based products. So I have responsibility also for what we call cloud operations, or running things like Creative Cloud or Document Cloud, or PDF if you're familiar with any of the Adobe products. So, as Adobe, so on myself, I've been in the industry for over 25 years, and I have a pretty varied background, varied in that I've been in different industry groups. I've always been in technology. I've always been in IT, even though, I have a degree in finance. But I've worked in insurance. I've worked in transportation and logistics. I've worked in retail and now in high tech. And I think that, that provides a pretty good view of a number of different verticals and solutions and challenges that I can apply to the day-to-day that I have Adobe. At Adobe, our strategy is to really enrich individuals so that they can create and be super creative at what they do. And then also work with companies so that they can transform how they do business, how they interact with their own customers. With that, 7 years ago, Adobe went on a journey. We used to sell, software on a disk, and now we're all SaaS-based, cloud-based. That was 7 years ago. And if you think about how we've evolved over those 7 years, in my role, as the CIO, my organization needs to evolve. So I see that my role is really to work with them and to help them, come onto the next journey of technology. So with that, we've adopted what we call a strategy to be cloud-like and really, enable everything that we do to be easy and self-service. We also work a lot with data. So transforming our whole data infrastructure and really being customer-focused and predictive when we do that. And the last area is really around operational excellence. This is really operational excellence in, running the cloud-based solutions that we have, but also operational-based excellence when you think about how do you run the business within Adobe? How do you make that really efficient? How do you make that very customer-focused along the lines of the customer journey? So with that, I'll turn it over to Bobby.
Thank you, Cynthia. Hello, everyone. I'm Bobby Soni. I run solutions and services. I want to apologize up front if I sound hoarse. I was at the college football championship game last night, and a Clemson fan, so you can imagine why I'm sore. But go Tigers. So I want to tell you a little bit about. I want to give you a context about the transformation journey that we are on in Hitachi, right? So when you look at, I am at Hitachi Vantara, which is a wholly owned subsidiary of Hitachi. And Hitachi is an industrial conglomerate, right? So we build the bullet train, we build heavy machinery, earth-moving equipment, nuclear reactors, and even MRI machines, right? So it's a very wide spectrum of operational expertise. So when you look at 100 years of operational expertise, and then you look at our DNA in technology, which is Hitachi Vantara, which is sort of expertise around data and analytics. So this convergence of what OT and IT is creating an unprecedented opportunity in the marketplace to drive value and to drive new business models, right? So we are working with very specific use cases for customers to drive innovative value. And I'll use a couple examples to sort of highlight that, right? We are working with one of the largest oil and gas explorers in the world, and using domain knowledge, ML, AI, and deep learning, we are able to really optimize the selection of the location to drill, right? So that's sort of the biggest latency for exploration. If I can really get to the point where I feel very confident that I'm going to strike oil, and I can reduce that process from 7 months to 7 days, it translates into a significant amount of dollars to the bottom line, right? So that's one example of a solution. We're working with a large amusement park company on a very different end of the spectrum, and using video, LiDAR, and sensors on rides, we're creating a suite of safety applications. So if someone stands up or leans over too far on a ride, it can automatically cut off, right? So those are examples of very domain specific. Now, this is a digital transformation panel, and you may say that that's great, but that's just solution development and innovation. So, I think there's a very important distinction between digitization and digitalization, right? Most people kind of lose that difference. It's a nuance, but it's a really important nuance. So digitizing creates solutions, but digitalization creates new business models. So let me sort of explain that briefly, right? Now, we sell a bullet train to a country, to a city, and that's a good business, but it's sold as a capital expenditure. Now, in the future, what's going to happen and what's already happening is cities may want to buy that as a service. So what they will buy is a train as a service, and the metric is number of passengers traveled per mile equals X dollars, right? So now, in order to be able to do that business, Hitachi needs to transform digitally, because in order to measure that, in order to sell it that way, in order to service it that way, in order to maintain it that way, we've got to be a very different company. So that's really kind of highlights the transformation challenge that we are addressing, and pretty exciting. But that's hopefully that gives you a bit of a difference between digitization and digitalization, which I think is relevant.
Excellent, excellent. And I'm Paul Salome. I'm also with Deloitte. I lead our global telecom, media, and technology practice, and I'm also our global leader for our technology sector practice. Now, this is a great foundation to get started, because we've got everything represented here at a time when everything is changing. Commonly, we hear that almost anything you can think of that historically was delivered as a product or as a canned software can now be delivered as a service. Well, we've got multinational conglomerate represented here, we've got software represented here, we've got traditional services, which are also being disrupted and now finding new ways to be delivered that are wedded with technology solutions. So maybe for this next piece, let's drill a little deeper into your own experiences, either in helping companies go through this transformation or in your own enterprise. What are some of the ways in which you have worked in your capacities to help on this journey, and what is it that you've seen companies going through in this process of business model transformation?
I can start, and I can build on what Bobby was talking about with the bullet train, which is really fascinating. I mentioned that Adobe went on this journey about 7 years ago to move from packaged software to cloud-based services. So I like everybody to kind of think about that experience, and I'll kind of take you on a journey of what that means on the systems and the process side and how you have to think about that change. So we used to ship these, discs out to stores and partners and whatever. So if you think about it, there's a huge supply chain, right, that needs to be managed. And if it goes out to, a store and you buy it, do you really know who your customer is? You don't really know your customers. You know who store you sold it to, but do you really know who came into that store and actually purchased that disc, right? So you kind of think about the prior way and what your customer journey and what your customer touch points were in kind of this physical world, and then you kind of contrast it with the cloud-based world. So if you buy and download your software through through Adobe.com, we know who you are, right? And we have instrumentation in the products, so we know how you use things. We know what you're challenged with, so we can provide you help. We know your journey as you go through and use the products. So before, you're coming from a base of not even knowing who the customer is, and now through understanding that whole journey of the customer. And if you think about that and then think about the systems and the process implications, before, you'd send a batch of these discs out and you'd have bill to one person. Now you've got this interactive billing that takes place on, a commerce site. You have to service the customer with interactive help. All of this used to be behind the scenes. So when you think about digitization, you really have to think about how do you take these processes that you had that really operated kind of behind the scenes and then really open them up to your customers and interact really in real time in a way that is going to make the customer happy. And you have to do that in a manner where you can't just rip and replace all of your back office systems. So you have to really think of ways, and what we've done is we really thought about ways of how do we become cloud enabled, or how do we start changing these touch points so that they're interactive, they're responsive. We can, measure the customer satisfaction as you go through the purchase process, as you go through the billing process, as you go through, any of the support processes, which used to all be disconnected, and now they're all connected real time with the customer. So that's, one thing that, when you go through digitization, you really have to look at the process, and you have to look at the technology that supports it. And one thing I'll say is many processes have been designed to be, efficient for back office, but that doesn't always mean that they are customer friendly. So you have to really take an outside-in view versus an inside-out view, and think about ways that you can use cloud, that you can use some of the newer technologies in order to create that experience.
And I'll build on the tech and process side to also talk about the cultural side of it, right? So Deloitte's obviously been on a journey of transformation over the years as well, right? Most of you know we purely an audit business and the tax business, then into consulting and really strategy-based consulting, and now truly a technology company, right? And that journey takes a mind shift as well, right? It takes a mind shift on the part of our leadership to understand what being a tech company means, right? It's not just dabbling in tech and exploring it, or maybe telling you I'm going to take my client to tech, but it's about us doing it ourselves, right? And us transforming our back office and our systems in order to enable it, as Bobby just talked about. And it also takes a tech-savvy workforce, right? We have to really transform who we are, and we've implemented things like the tech spectrum, right? Are you tech curious? Are you savvy? Are you fluent? And making sure that every one of our employees gets to tech savvy, and then certain get to tech fluent in very specific areas, right? Because if we're a tech company, everybody that we work with and around needs to be focused on that same thing. From a client perspective, right, as we talk about helping our clients become more tech savvy and digitized, people always ask, well, I've got legacy businesses, right, and I can't stop serving my customers the way I serve them today, right, so how do I do that at the same time I'm transforming? And people look at it in a couple different ways. Some people think that you have to separate the core from the edge, right? Protect the core, let them do what they're doing, don't disrupt them so that I maintain my revenue and my sales, et cetera, and let the small group out there start innovating, right? And sometimes that works because you alleviate them from the bureaucracy and the administration of your core and let them really be creative. However, it creates challenges. Because now you've created a special class of people. You haven't created the touch points by which to actually transform the core itself, because that's what needs the transformation. And so either you have to let the core die off or you have to bring them with you, right? And depending on your organization and the culture of your organization and what your business line is, there are different models for how that works. But I would say that most people who are successful have really figured out a way for the core and edge to live together.
Yeah, I think the cultural part is so important, both internally, because people are used to the way that they've been operating. And one of the things that we did within IT is we instituted this strategy and this motto of we want to have cloud-like characteristics in our DNA. And when I first started talking to people about that, they kind of looked at me and said, well, what do you mean? What could that possibly mean? Are you talking about operations? Is that, what's in your head? I said, no, think about the characteristics of a cloud. It's easy to work with, ubiquitous, all these other things. You can apply that to anything that you're doing in your day-to-day activity. If you're in, a support organization, think about the interaction with people and how you make it easier to do. So, getting to the cultural component and helping people to think different and letting them experiment, they'll reinvent their own jobs too to get on that bandwagon of how the company is becoming digitized.
Yeah, that's I definitely, I can relate to everything you guys are saying because in our experience, I'll talk maybe one on the business dimension. I think most of you know that it's almost impossible to say, I'll forget about the core, I'll just transform and I'll be a new company. It's almost impossible, right? For a company that's been around a while, that has sales channels, that has products in the market, that has customers that use those products. So it is absolutely proverbial cliche, you gotta change the engine in mid-flight, right? It's absolutely that. And don't anybody let you tell otherwise, because that's the challenge we are all facing, right? So the one thing we found was that having a North Star is so critical. So I think people do not align behind the transformation until and unless there is a very clear, lucid, and an elegant North Star, right? So we all need to know that, hey, we're going to become an outcomes as a service company, and this is what it looks like. And maybe there are milestones to that journey, and these are the signposts. There are 4 signposts on my way to that journey, and that journey is 28 months long, right? Just making that up. But that clarity, I know it sounds obvious, but I'm sure you're used to it within your organization that's highly distributed, that part of the organization in Europe versus Asia versus the US, we may have and will have different points of views around the transformation. So one, having a very strong executive alignment and a North Star that you can put up on one slide that everybody can nod their head to. So that's one aspect. And then the cultural aspect becomes absolutely mission critical, right? So the way we try to solve that is we are in 132 countries, and there was no way we were going to get on a town hall, a global town hall, and espouse this transformation and expect that every sort of local office would embrace it and actually lean into it. That's just not practical, right? So we created this concept of transformation or change ambassadors, and these are peers in local offices that people look up to, they relate to, and they respect. And then those people lean into this conversation. We brought them in physically to actually understand it in gory detail, and then they went back into the offices to make sure that the people get it. So that was one cultural aspect that we had to really put in place. And then the last piece around systems and processes, if we're selling a hardware box or a large earth-moving machinery today, and tomorrow I want to sell an outcome, the entire back office and the front office needs a new set of processes and systems, right? And to Cynthia's point, what we decided was, let's keep customer centricity as the guiding principle and then design from that, as opposed to get caught up in a back office project that never ends.
Right.
So that was another way we approached it.
All the way through everything about your systems too, from tracking and billing to
thing.
collecting
The whole
to
thing, yeah.
The whole
reporting to the regulators, taxation, everything, defending,
Everything.
protecting, everything.
Everything
So you can
changes.
see a story here emerging about how pervasive this transformation is across the enterprise. It affects the people, the processes, the systems, the value propositions, the services, the top line, the bottom line, everything about an enterprise is on the table and part of this journey. That's why it's so challenging. I want to drill, go ahead.
Yeah, I
Go
just
ahead.
want to, sorry, Paul, I want to say, just add one more thing on the cultural aspect, because you've got this big journey ahead of you, and they're all different, right? I mean, we went to SaaS for our software. You're going to SaaS, really, a service for bullet trains. So you don't really know what's ahead, and you don't know fully what's going to work and what's not going to work. So one of the points I wanted to raise is you're going to make mistakes, right?
Yeah.
So everybody's going to make mistakes. And you have to tolerate mistakes, and actually, in some cases, reward mistakes, because that discovery on that mistake could help you do something totally different that maybe you didn't even think about.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to raise that as a point.
To drill even deeper on just even that aspect of it, culturally around the globe, there are very different views on risk and whether
Yes.
it's acceptable to make professional mistakes.
Right.
So that's another dimension, right? That is a real challenge.
Yeah, and I'd say as we're standing up our innovation function, one of our guiding principles is failure must happen, right? Not that it's just tolerated, but if you're not failing, you're not taking enough risks. And we're not pushing the envelope enough, and we're not pushing our business enough, right? Because if we're not failing, we're playing it safe.
Yeah. So I want to go a little deeper into systems and processes and talk a little bit about the other animal that's been introduced, which is cloud, and the continuing journey for enterprises around cloud, including all the different permutations now of, well, I want a private cloud on-prem, or I want a full public cloud, or I want a hybrid, or I want multi-cloud. I don't want to be tied down and vendor locked. And what workloads am I putting into a cloud environment? What am I not? That whole dimension also plays in at the same time. So perspectives, thoughts on that arena?
I could start with that, and then, of course, Cynthia, I'm sure, has a lot of experience in that. So when we think about digital transformation, we define 3 pillars. And of course, there are many elements to a transformation, including culture. But when it comes to technology, we think about cloud, we think about an analytics platform, analytics capability, analytics DNA. And then the third thing that's become even more important lately is around insight, predictive insight driven by machine learning AI. So those are the 3. So when we think about digital transformation, these are, in essence, ingredients to make anything happen, right? So having an agile infrastructure is table stakes, whether it's private, public, or hybrid. Having deep data analytics capability is table stakes. And then driving predictive learning is essential in order for those business models to succeed. So if I'm going to sell an earth mover and charge by cubic feet of earth moved per day, as opposed to a $10 million earth mover, then I need to have enough machine learning and predictive intelligence that it doesn't break down, there is no unplanned downtimes, et cetera, right? So when we think about technology, those are the 3 pillars we sit sort of everything on.
And I totally agree. I mean, we have the same pillars. What I would add to the pillars, Bobby, that you talked about is really architecture, because you can do a lot of damage if you don't really think about what your architecture is going to be. It's kind of like the North Star that guiding star that you talked about before, you really need to understand how you're going to use different technologies and how you can bring them into play. How you look at the governance around data, all the different, I mean, the technology is the fun part, but you really need to put this wrapper of architecture and governance around it in order to really get the full value. We have complex environments, and in the ideal world, you kind of throw everything away and start over, but that never happens. So when you look at if you look at what you have internally on the system side, you really need to come up with principles that people can understand, again, to the North Star, because that helps people make decisions as they're making changes. And then also look to how do you decouple this and move to a cloud-based infrastructure, but yet not destroy what you have to run the business. And what we've done in that light is come up with both cloud native and cloud enabled. So for brand new things, we go cloud native and make sure that is designed to run in the cloud. But on our older technologies and older solutions that still serve the business, is we've really gone through a process to make them cloud enabled. So you use some of those characteristics of the cloud, and you apply the resiliency, you apply some of the redundancy, the ability to burst to the applications that you have in-house. So then you get the same cloud feel and performance and experience, but you haven't ripped and replaced everything out. So architecture and governance is what I would add to your pillars.
Yeah.
And the only thing I would echo as well is on the strategy and governance side, right? One, you will never just use one cloud, right? It's just not possible these days. With all the SaaS solutions available, with all the options in cloud native, et cetera, you will have a multi-cloud management strategy. And the sooner organizations understand that that's a reality, the better you are at getting in front of managing, how do you access that cloud? Who's allowed to actually create those services? How do you manage all of the compliance across those clouds? How do you manage the integration across those clouds, right? And a lot of that is, there's technical pieces, but a lot of that is simply process, governance, and the rules of your organization. And so how do you get in front of that? And how do you decide what does your IT group do and what does your business do, right? Because now the business can go direct and can kind of procure this as a service without even using the IT organization. Is that okay? Is that not okay, right? How do you get the CIO more involved? I'm sure, Cynthia, you go through this a lot.
Yeah, well, that's a great point, because technology is everywhere. It used to be technology was behind these walls of the IT organization. So you really need to come up with those principles. And my view is that my area, the IT and cloud ops area, is there to enable a company, which means we don't want any walls. We want the business to be able to go out. We want to provide the right frameworks for integrations so that they can integrate to back office systems. We want to, enable access to data, self-service. And we've even gone as far as within our data analytics area is operating like an open source community. So business people can distribute or create code and distribute it back, and then it gets approved and it's available to everybody.
Right.
So a real open environment.
Yeah, so you're really enabling the business to do that, right?
Yeah.
And the last thing I'll add, that's the security, privacy, compliance, right? We can't not talk about that in any tech conversation. And I think the important piece there is understanding they should never be an afterthought, right? It should be upfront and built in with the system. We've talked a lot over the last couple of years about DevOps, and a lot of people have moved to that framework. Well, we really need to add DevSecOps, right? And it needs to be something that's built in way up front so that it doesn't stop your business down the line. And so really understanding how that plays in your process is important.
And I want to go into that one a little more deeply also. I think also what you've outlined, Cindy, is that the role of the CIO has changed. Pretty
Yes.
dramatically, right? You much more than ever before, you have to really know and understand not only the business of today, but where it's headed.
That's right.
Right?
That's
Yeah.
exactly right.
Huge
You need
impact.
to stay close to the business. You need to understand the plans, the growth, how it's changing, and not only within your own business, adjacent businesses, and you can learn from, other businesses as well, other verticals, because those learnings you can bring in, because, your competitor today may, or your non-competitor today may be your competitor tomorrow. So you really have to look at the whole landscape.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about some of the underlying technologies themselves, specifically with a lot of the discussion around AI and in particular how cloud is making some of the AI tools more available and easier to use, and in some cases less demanding on internal talent and resourcing in order to apply some of these technologies in the business, whether we're talking about machine learning or deep learning or other, or even if you're thinking about the discussion about RPA being used on processes. What are you seeing as, in that realm, the tools that you're finding to be the most mature, the most useful, or the most widely deployed as you're going through this whole journey?
You want to start us off?
Yeah, I can start. You know, we've done a lot with machine learning, AI, and actually RPA also. I'll give a few examples. Actually, my favorite, I'll just say off the top, RPA I think is my favorite because I think you can do a lot to really better back office operations and, you know, eliminate a lot of the mundane activities that people have to do. And the way that I view that particular one is it's not really a job eliminator. What we're doing is creating capacity with a virtual workforce, right? So you have your physical, your human workforce, and you also have your virtual workforce. But we've been able to use that technology, you know, in our procurement area to, you know, to speed up and eliminate 80% of the activities that is done, you know, when they're working on contracts and things like that.
8-0?
8-0, yeah.
80%.
Yeah, 80%. And, you know, we've used it in other areas as well. Now, one thing I'll say about that is we kind of touched on strategy and governance. You really need to have strategy and governance. These tools can be opened up to the business, which I'm totally, fully in support of. But you need to have the governance around it for security and compliance, because once you start getting into your back office and your, you know, your compliance-related activities, you want to make sure that you keep those controls in place. So you need to think about that. You know, on the artificial intelligence, machine learning side, we've done a lot of work with that, not only with our product, but also in our, you know, in our ops area. You know, with automating different things that, you know, can go wrong, not to automate them to go wrong, but to automate it to fix. So anything that you can fix manually, if you have something running that would become a problem or an issue, we've been able to build a knowledge base that will automatically fix it, and that's reduced, you know, a lot of the, you know, time to serve. So you need to really look, I think, for different applications, and, you know, there's a lot of value there, lots of time savings. And it's actually also a skill upgrade too, because people who used to do the manual work now their jobs switched to actually writing scripts.
Yeah, so maybe one of the things that I think every enterprise struggles with, almost every enterprise in the world, is the ability to manage data from end to end. Right? So we all know that that's one of the hairiest problems out there, right? And now with the advent of cloud and a lot of the services that the cloud companies make available, they've taken a lot of that complexity out. So what we find is we talk about DevOps and DevSecOps, but there's a sort of a new way to think about it is data ops. And that incorporates ingestion of data from sources, cleansing it, classifying it, getting it ready so that ML AI can operate on it. Now, in general, when companies try to solve this problem, you know, they all sort of go about it in their own way, but this is something that can be highly automated. And you can create a data platform and a pipeline that's highly automated. So now, when you want to do an experiment, because what you want is the sources of data to be available, and I'll use a simple example. We work with American Heart Association, and they're doing, you know, when you get a grant, it was amazing that 80% of the time in that grant duration went to procuring, standing up, getting data, getting permissions, getting security, getting policies. 80% of the time for the grant went into those activities, and only 20% actually led to research and insight, right? So now, by using a public cloud platform that we have hardened, they are able to instantaneously have a research environment with HIPAA compliance, all built in with a push button, right? So you see the dramatic difference technology and automation made in that particular case. And you can take that example in every industry. So that data ops automation in that big oil and gas company from 7 months to 7 days, in AHA from 6 months to instantaneous. So when you see the benefits, they're just unbelievable in terms of what you can do now.
Yeah. And I would say, I think it's not just any one technology, it's the integration of them that's the most powerful, right? So you've got cloud, how do you use the assets there, like you said, with data, right? People don't just want data, they want insights, right? They want value. So how do you really understand what you have from a data perspective so you can get to value? And that value you have to generate not just from the tech, but by understanding the business, right? What question could you answer that would improve the value of your business? And how do you work backwards then to understand what data you have, where do you have it, and then what algorithms do I need to actually use to produce those insights? So I think that's one area. I say we haven't touched on blockchain at all, but and I know it's not a right here and now, but right here and now, there's tons and tons of proofs of concepts, and there's a lot of production-light things happening because people are really finding the value in blockchain in order to transact information between parties, right? Right now, to transact information between parties, there's a whole lot of ETL, there's a whole lot of negotiation between whose data is whose, and where it should sit, and where it should reside, and who should be the intermediary of it. Blockchain will revolutionize that for us, I believe, right? And I think it's, at the cusp because there's a lot of things to work out from a regulatory perspective. No one's really touched it to understand what to do. And fundamentally, blockchain happens in consortiums. And by default, that means lots of parties having to work together, which means it's slow, right? Just by the nature of what it is. And so as we see that continue to happen, I think that things like settlements and claims and supply chain transactions and digital identities, right, all become a possibility that happens without intermediaries and that happens in a much more efficient manner between parties.
So you snuck HIPAA in there, Bobby. One example of privacy and security issues, it's been mentioned governance and also consideration, don't forget about. Any quick thoughts on how you make sure that privacy and security issues that are either from regulatory that are proliferating around the world, GDPR and other, it's just some of the just general concerns. How do you incorporate these into your strategies and into your transformations?
I mean, the first principle is that security's got to be a first-class citizen feature, right? I think Nishida mentioned it, that security is almost always an afterthought and a retrofit exercise. Used to be. Let me rephrase that. It has changed quite a bit. But when we think about security, even with the public cloud, we have projects with the DoD where we pass the bar for security at the highest possible level. So it's not, the security is not, technology is all available to secure anything, whether it's encryption, whether it's authorizations, whether it's blockchain. Technology is not the challenge. I think it's the design principle that's the challenge, right? So you gotta, it's as important as designing that first line of code in your application. So you gotta think of it up front in the design process. And one other IoT specific challenge is, we've read about, taking over your Jeep or car and driving it off the road. We've all sort of read those things. Truly, when you have an edge or an endpoint that is, accessible to the network, then you have to be really, really conscious of security profiles related to those endpoints, whether it's, a nuclear reactor or a bullet train or a car or anything of that nature. So we have to be, even more vigilant as we design that security around the endpoint.
Yeah, I think those are absolutely great points. I'll add one thing to it, which is you really have to, you mentioned, thinking about it at the front end and getting it into the product. I think you need to make it simple for people so that they don't have to decipher all of the different, security, and privacy, guidelines and things that you need to comply with. For us at Adobe, we've incorporated it into what we call our product life cycle and the development cycle. So everybody needs to be aware of the different security requirements, and we build them into the product, like you said, as we go. But if you look at SOC 2 and HIPAA and all these other ones, I mean, it's kind of mind-boggling to look at it. So what we've done is we've taken all the components, the common components, and created a framework that we call CCF, or our Common Controls Framework, and simplified it to the point to say, okay, if your service needs to deal with HIPAA, here's your checklist. This is what you need to think about as you go through the product development process. And so this one framework handles all the different security components. So if I'm in the engineering group developing a product or enhancing a product, and I need to be compliant with HIPAA, okay, check, 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 I'm done. And then you don't have to have each group kind of deciphering and figuring it out.
And I'll just add, right, there's security, there's privacy, there's compliance. There's also the ethical impacts of technology, right? Technology is changing so fast, and there are so many incredibly positive connotations and impacts of it, but there are negative ones too, right? And we, as business leaders, I think have a responsibility to identify those up front and help mitigate the risks, because we are the ones, after all, creating the new tech, right? And so we have a responsibility to make sure it's used appropriately, right? For example, we've talked a lot about AI and algorithms, and we're humans creating the AI and algorithms. So as a result, there are unconscious biases that often get worked into those, right? There was an example where they were using AI in order to do some recruiting and to create a base of resumes for certain tech jobs. Turns out they only identified male resumes. Why? Because they were trained on resumes, and people who already worked there were already male, right? It wasn't intentional, right? It wasn't to screen out females purposefully, but unconsciously, the data and the algorithms were trained to do something that was unintended. And so we have to be very conscious as we create these things that we're not, creating negative side effects.
Yeah, hugely important. We were having this discussion before we came on stage that puts a restriction on, at a minimum, it puts a restriction on what you can accomplish and what you can achieve, because you've unconsciously limited your population, right, and you're not taking into account all the dimensions that could be brought to value. Mm-hmm. That brings us kind of back to people again, mm-hmm, and we talked a lot about culture. This is a really pervasive transformation for what we do and how we do it. Any quick thoughts on the impact on the workforce?
So I can start. Yeah, I think there is an impact on the workforce, right? And I think that we're foolish if we don't believe that's true. But I think there can be very positive impacts. And it's all in the way that we help people adopt new technologies, help people get trained with new skills, and help us culturally as an organization move to the next level, right? When we think about it as kind of what's the future of work? Right? What will people be doing? How will people be doing it? Where will they be located? It's a strategic imperative of every company to really think about how do they do that proactively, right? Are you using your on-balance sheet employee resources? Are you going to start using off-balance resources like the crowd, right? And gig workers? And how do you use that? And how do you integrate them into your organization, right? What do you allow your own employees to do? And how do you allow them to have and gain additional skills within your organization, right? I think every company has to realize that people don't just or can't just actually learn to work. They have to work to learn. And there's a very big difference in a mindset shift around that, and really moving towards that working to learn for your organization will not only set your people up and the workforce up for success, but will set you up, because technology changes too quickly, right? And if you don't have an organization that can actually work to learn, you yourself will become obsolete.
Yeah, I totally agree. One thing I would add is that, in the past, I think we've looked at the base of employees and said everybody works the same way. which, really isn't the case. And even in the past, people would say, would work around that. So I think it's important to really, work with the workforce and determine the different types of personas that your workers have. One of the things that we've done is we've gone through and looked at, who we have and the types of roles that we have, not the types of roles per se, but actually what people do. And we've come up with different personas, like a builder or a communicator or customer facing or an enabler, and then gear the tools that the workforce uses to those particular personas as opposed to one size fits all. Also, you need to give people the ability to experiment and try new things out. So another thing that we've used, which has been pretty successful, is we have what we call Lab 82, which is where we bring in new office types of technologies, and people can schedule meetings and do work in these rooms, and we observe them. And then we find out what works and what doesn't work. And I'll have to say that that's probably one of the best things that we've done, because we've seen a lot of failures in that room where if we had rolled it out company-wide, we would have spent a ton of money and the stuff wouldn't have been used. So, really looking and understanding the type of workers you have, their styles, and, how they're, adapting and what they're using is really important in the new workforce.
Yeah, I mean, I'll zoom out for a minute if you allow me. There is obviously a lot of write-up about AI, ML, deep learning is going to, create a big disruption and in the workforce, and it's going to take away, some numbers talk about 84% of the jobs, and I think it's important to step back. When the agricultural revolution happened and then the industrial revolution happened, there were similar concerns, especially when the Industrial Revolution happened, that everybody's going to, all the farmers will starve to death because now the new economy will displace all of them, right? So I think the way at least I'd like to look at that is there's an opportunity with this revolution, the information revolution or the intelligence revolution, to actually create a significant impact on world GDP. So the other way to look at this is that it will actually accelerate and create growth of the kind that we haven't seen in the last few decades. And that will propel another workforce revolution and create a whole other set. So that's my glass half full view of AI ML. So having said that, there is a real challenge on a today basis, especially when we look at our workforce, and we talked about the changing the engine in mid-flight. We are transforming to a business that's very different from the current business. And how do you, in a good, effective way, make that transition for the workforce, right? So I think education and learning is really, really important, and it doesn't just begin and end with our company. I think it's a societal and a government question that I think is got to be addressed fairly quickly, because it's a macro pattern that's going to impact every single one of us, and especially our children and grandchildren, right? So, but in the near term, we are, as Cynthia described, we are creating trajectories of roles, and roles that do not even exist today. And then we've got a talent or workforce management plan that talks about learning, transition, and then much different ways of getting work done, like the gig economy or crowdsourcing or scale in those fashions.
Well said. Even a little more recent than the agricultural or industrial revolution, we all were around when laptop computers became available, and we still remember everyone saying, "Oh, everybody's going to have so much free time. You should invest in travel and hospitality and leisure, because everyone's going to be vacationing." And that isn't the way it's playing out, right? We all do things now because they're possible, and they weren't possible before. Exactly. And so we're busier than we ever were. We've got about 2 minutes each for the last parting comments, and I'll leave it up to you what you would like to share, either your perspective on sort of a forward look, looking around the corner, looking into your crystal ball, what do you think is going to happen, or lessons learned, traps for the unwary on your personal journey so far, or both. It's up to you, about 2 minutes each, and then we're going to wrap. So we can start with you, Bobby, and work this
just
way.
quick lessons learned. I mean, I'll talk about lessons learned since we're in the thick of the fight and the transformation journey. So I think to me it's very personal. So number one is that, in some ways you've got to suspend a bit of disbelief, and it's okay to be almost considered naive, because in a lot of ways the amount of change you're trying to drive, if you get really analytical about the change and you start sort of planning every step now, you're going to freeze and you'll never sort of make it to the other side. So suspend a bit of disbelief, set goals for chunks. So chunk it up. I mean, it's a 3-year journey. I've got to have X in 3 months and Y in 6 months and Z in 9 months, right? So kind of have that type of passion and that type of sort of approach to a transformation. Because I bet you, if you try to sort of plot all your moves out, and you'll get extremely frustrated, and I think that impetus will fade. So that's kind of the number one lesson, I think. And the number two lesson is, you got to recruit the people who are actually doing the work in the field with customers. You've got to recruit them. This is not a boardroom exercise. This is not an executive exercise. This is a company exercise, and you've got to do that. Otherwise, you will never gain enough momentum in order to turn the corner. So those are the two top things that I would like to share.
Okay, I'll go next, and I'll be quick. So the first one is about looking kind of around the corner. Check out new technologies. Be inquisitive, and match them up in your head about how can they be used in my business, right? And make suggestions, because if you're waiting for people to say, this is what I need, you might not ever get to where you want to be. If you look at technologies, if you look at what could be and make suggestions, I think that you can marry them up and you can have them more successful. Because sometimes people just don't know what could be, and you need to be able to suggest that. My second would be kind of more on the lessons learned. Is sometimes I mentioned sometimes things don't work. You have failures. You can be in the midst of a large effort, and or you're getting the feel that it's just not going to work. It's okay to stop it too, and say, this is enough. I'm not going to invest any more in it. Sometimes we don't do that, with large technologies, investments. We say we need to get to the end, even though as you get through a portion of it, people know it's not the right thing to do. So course correct and be brave in order to do that.
So my two things are, one, every single company today is a technology company, no matter what. Even if you're in retail, you're in farming, you're in whatever worldwide activity you're in, you're a tech company. And one, understanding that, and then understanding how you're going to use tech to be your competitive advantage, right? And that's the thing that sets you apart from your competitors. So how is that going to help you? So that's one question for executives, leadership teams to really answer and come to grips with. Second, it's around partnerships. Right? No matter how big your company is, no matter how much talent you have, there is more outside your organization than inside of it. And that's something that we are embracing at Deloitte by creating this new innovation engine to partner with startups and those that are really investing in R&D, developing new technologies, and then helping to figure out how to apply that in your organization or to others, right? And so creating the right set of partnerships is an imperative in today's ecosystem, and making sure you have a match culturally, technically, and as a fit with your vision and strategy.
And I would just say, keep in mind that we're really just getting started. It feels like we've been on this journey for a while, but when we look back on our careers, This, you talked about the Industrial Revolution, the agricultural revolution. I don't know what the nomenclature will be. Maybe it'll be the fourth Industrial Revolution. But this will be marked in time as the moment when everything in the world changed about our lives and about business and the way everything worked. And people will ask us stories about what was it like to be there. So realize that we're there, realize that we're just getting started, and be fearless and take those steps and move forward, because the gun has fired and the race has begun. Thank you, Bobby, Cindy, Nishida, and thank you to all of you for being with us today. We hope you found this useful.